Okay, so let's get started here. For all the folks who managed to drag themselves out of the bed and hopefully have sufficiently recovered from last night's festivities, thanks for dropping by. You're at the talk that's going to be about extending the browser programming model with Silverlight. I'm one of the program managers who deals with a number of the non-UI related aspects of the Silverlight framework. And that's basically what I'm going to be walking through with you today in more detail. You've probably seen a few of these areas in previous talks. But what we'll start out with is drilling into more detail in the HTML interop feature, hopefully peeling back the covers a little bit and giving you a bit of more information on how it works and what you can do with it. Then I'll switch gears and I'll talk some more about web services. Again, just talking about sort of underneath the hood, how we implemented it inside of the Silverlight managed framework, and also talk about hooking up things like app services to Silverlight. I'll touch on isolated storage, which is a feature that lets you sort of get beyond the limitations of cookie storage when you're writing client-side apps. And then we'll round out the discussion going through a sample application using the open file dialog control, which gives you read-only access to files off of a customer's file system. And just an FYI, the deck I'm going through right now and also all of the samples that we'll be looking at over the next hour or so are all up here on my little sandbox site. So they've already been uploaded earlier this morning and they're available for all of you folks to download. Okay, so the first topic I wanted to go through was how the HTML interop feature is structured inside of Silverlight, what you can do with it, and then I'll step you through some pieces of sample code on it. So the general purpose of the HTML interop feature is to give you guys the ability to sort of reach out from managed code and somehow be able to touch HTML DOM objects as well as JavaScript objects and interact with them. And then also vice versa, be able to have a JavaScript developer reach into managed code and go invoke functionality that a managed developer has loaded up onto the page. So the first thing I've got up here is basically the type hierarchy for how managed code reaches out and touches the HTML DOM. Everything that we do inside of the HTML interop feature is considered to be a scriptable object. And the reason why we have this type up at the root of the hierarchy is that we basically have ways of wrapping both just general JavaScript objects as well as specifically objects that you get out of the HTML DOM. And so we consider all of those to be things that you could normally script against inside of JavaScript, and we represent that with this abstract-based type. Now, normally you're not going to be able to new up a scriptable object out of nowhere. You basically have to get references to such things from other APIs, and one of them is what I've got up here, the window object. So if you've seen from earlier demos, you usually start out using this type called HTML page, and it's the entry point into the feature. It has a bunch of static properties and methods hanging off of it. Again, we'll look at it in a few minutes. But one of the things that you get is you can get, for example, a reference to a managed wrapper of the window that you're familiar with from JavaScript coding. And a window, for example, is considered to be a type of HTML object. So it's a specialization of a scriptable object. Not only can you go poke at it and get and set properties and do things like that, but it also has some kind of HTML-like behavior. And specifically in the alpha, what that consists of is the addition of the ability to attach and detach event handlers. And then certainly for the alpha, and probably for even at RTM, the most common thing that developers would probably use are at the bottom of the type hierarchy. So we have a strongly typed wrapper for the document that you're familiar with from coding against the browser DOM. And then, of course, once you've got a document, one of the most common things you do is you say, oh, let's reach out there, go get me a reference to an element. And what you get back is a managed wrapper called an HTML element. Now, the one thing that you obviously don't see up here, and that I just wanted to briefly address, is that we didn't go out and build like a huge managed library that wraps every single DOM object known to man across IE, Firefox, and Safari. What we do instead is we have these sort of generalized type wrappers. They're actually pretty powerful and pretty flexible, and we made that decision in large part because we weren't sure that there was a whole lot of value in suddenly creating a comparatively massive type library that wraps all of the known DOM objects. And for those of you who've ever played around, for example, with the IE ActiveX control or try to wrap it and consume it from managed code, you actually know how big that thing gets. So again, if you're looking in the hierarchy and wondering like, hey, where's the input element, that's why there isn't like a specific type for an input element or a hidden element or a button or things like that. So okay, what I'm going to do now is switch over to Visual Studio and take a look at a pre-built project I've got that does a fair amount of HTML manipulations. I'm not going to walk through all of it. You've probably seen the simpler aspects in previous talks, but I wanted to touch on some of the potentially more complex or more arcane areas of the interop feature. So what I've done in this project is I have a very simple page that happens to have a text area amongst other things on it. And what I'd like to do is actually hook one of the events that gets surfaced off of a text area, specifically the onBlur method. Now the reason why I wanted to call this out is, again, in previous talks you've probably seen the basic way of hooking up event handlers so that an event that comes out of the HTML DOM actually gets fired into managed code, and that tends to be the simpler approach for doing things. You can see what I'm highlighting here. You create just a regular event handler delegate. But what's not necessarily as obvious is there's also another variation, another way to hook events. And what I've highlighted here shows a variation of the generic event handler type that takes in something called HTML event args. And the reason why we have this variation is that it's not always just a matter of, oh great, some element did some event and now I'm going to go write managed code for it. Right? You frequently want all of the ambient information about the event to be carried along. So if we scroll down a bit and we take a look at what's available off of those HTML event args, you'll notice that you get a whole bunch of positional information. So you can get things like which mouse button has been pressed down, or what are the various keys that have been pressed down. So literally, if you wanted to go out and have like a rich text box where you're typing along on the keyboard, you could go out and use this variation of hooking up to an HTML event in order to get all of the key press info. And you also get access to things like, for example, the string representation of the event that was fired. So that's useful if you want to write one managed event handler and have it actually handle multiple event types, potentially from multiple different elements. The other critical thing is typically when you get an event fired from the HTML DOM into managed code, you don't necessarily know right off the bat, well, which element actually raised the event in the first place. And so there are two ways of doing it. One is if you happen to have typed your managed event handler to use HTML event args, you can actually pull up the source element very easily. And this just gives you an HTML element wrapper back to the HTML object that raised the event in the first place. The other option, and it's the one that I'm showing here in source code right now, is it turns out that in all cases where we're firing the events into managed code, you can just cast the sender, like I did here, back to an HTML element reference. So you don't necessarily need to use the more advanced event handler syntax in order to always get a reference back out to the object that fired the event. Now in this case, great, I'm basically hooking the blur event. What ends up happening is if I type some text into the browser, I'm going to go split it on the space. But what I wanted to really show is some other interesting things that we have available off of the HTML element type, one of which is the ability to manipulate style information. So you've probably seen already that you can do things like get attribute and set attribute off of an HTML element, and again, a very common operation. The thing is that that's not necessarily the way that browsers down at the native level actually route style information. And so that's why we actually have on all of our HTML elements both get style attribute and set style attribute overloads. And so what I'm doing here is just using that ability to go out and on the fly from managed code, reach out to that text element and automatically change the font information and some background color information. Now currently in the alpha, what works well are basically any pieces of style info that are string valued. So that tends to cover the vast majority of the style information that's out there. And what we'll be working on, again, as we sort of iterate on the alpha, is testing sort of a broader matrix of style attributes. So some things that are positional sometimes take in things like ints and longs. And again, right now, some of those just have some bugs in those areas. Now, a couple of other things that I've done inside of this application, we're just going to scroll down to another event handler, is I've made use of the HTML page type. Now, I alluded to it earlier that HTML page is typically, that's going to be the entry point that you as developers use to get into the HTML interop feature in Silverlight. And you can see there's actually a fair amount of information about the browser page that we expose off of this object. So, for example, if you want to know, hey, what's the URI, the actual address that's up in the browser address bar, we can give that to you as an instance of the system URI type. And then if other things like if you need to get access to query string info, or if you need to get access to the anchor tag that's available on the page, we give you the ability to get and set the anchor tag through this current bookmark property. And we also give you a read-only collection of query string values. So you don't actually have to sit there and try to parse apart the URI. We just do that for you magically underneath the hood. We do have a cookies property in the alpha. Right now it's a string property. You can get it and set it, but just FYI, at this point you're sort of left with having to do all the grungy client-side cookie manipulations. If you actually want to update the cookie, the plan is, again, as we work through stuff beyond the alpha, is to actually change this property over to give you a nice collection where you could just dynamically add and remove stuff, and underneath the hood we take care of all of the string manipulations to update the client-side cookie. So what I'm using the HTML page primarily here in this sample for was first just to sort of touch on the browser info object. So browser information is a managed wrapper around the navigator object that you can get to in JavaScript. So it gives you a really easy way to get some basic information about the browser, and of course one of the most important things being the user agent. Now the other thing that I'm doing in this method, and this is just mainly to have some code so folks can see it and hopefully get a better understanding of what I was talking about, for the heck of it, I went out and got a hold of a reference to the window. So this is the managed wrapper around the window object that you see in the browser. And I'm using this somewhat funky syntax here with get property. Now remember, everything in the HTML interop feature ultimately is considered some kind of a scriptable object. And what you can do today with any kind of scriptable object, whether it's an HTML element or just some other object that you could normally get out of the browser, you can get property values and you can set property values. The one thing that's currently not in the alpha is we don't give you the ability to just dynamically invoke an arbitrary method, but we do have that working internally, and you will actually see that again as we iterate and release some more CTPs and betas. So right now with an HTML object that itself is a kind of scriptable object, I can get the property. And the reason why we have this sort of generic syntax is, again, like I said earlier, rather than going out and trying to build strongly typed wrappers for every possible HTML and script object on the face of the planet, we instead try to boil it down to a bunch of generalized accessors. And so what you can do is, given a reference to anything, whether it's a JavaScript object or an HTML element or something like that, you can tell us, here's the string name of the property, and then you tell us, and oh, by the way, when you're bringing it back, when you're marshaling it back into managed code, this is what we think you can actually cast the thing to. And so in this case, what I've done is I've actually said, great, off of the window object, get me a reference to the navigator. So that's not an HTML element, right? It's just one of those sort of objects that have grown up over time, and every browser has support for it. And I've said, go give me this generalized ability to go poke at it and get and set properties on it. And then I actually use that a little bit later, and I say, great, given the navigator object, why don't you go out and look up some language information for me? And in that case, of course, it's a much simpler type. It's a string, and so it's very easy to marshal that back into the browser. Another thing I just wanted to briefly touch on is, you saw that on HTML page you can get, for example, query string information or anchor tags, things like that. There's actually another slick way that you can start up a Silverlight application and pass it some initialization info, and it's what we call startup arguments. So if we take a look over at the JavaScript that's associated with this page, you'll notice that what I did is in the Bootstrap JavaScript, I popped in this extra property, this init params property, and I actually provided it with some initialization information. And so this is a very easy way. It's in essence, it's a way to create a parameterized constructor, if you want to think of it that way, for your Silverlight application. And all you do is you provide a bunch of name-value pairs, some key and some value separated by an equal sign, And then you can have as many of them as you want. You just sort of hard to see, but it's separated by a comma. So you can do that from your JavaScript. And then what's nice is you can turn around and in manage code, there's this ambient type called web application. It's just always there for you. It's not specific to HTML, but I just wanted to call it out because it has a couple of interesting things hanging off of it. And what you can do is you can always just type in, hey, web application, give me the current instance. So underneath the hood, it's a singleton. There's only one and only one of those for any Silverlight application. And in this case, I can get access to those startup arguments that you saw over in JavaScript just off of the startup arguments property. And of course, here I'm not doing anything terribly interesting with it. I'm just walking through it as a generic collection. But you'll see a little bit later, I actually use these startup arguments to store the web service URLs for some of my later demos. So, okay, that's sort of a quick run through of some of the different features. What I'm going to do now is have us switch over to the Mac laptop. Okay. And what we'll do is I just went ahead and I compiled it over on my Windows machine, and it'll be a recurring theme here. I'll try to make sure that we can run all of the sample code that we're looking at here over on the Mac, so that again, right, everything I'm showing you is cross-platform. It's not just specific to Windows, and it's not just specific to Internet Explorer. So I've got Safari up here running on my Mac. I've got my my beautiful text area. And I'll just type in some text information, and then when I tab out of it and I blur out of it, you can see that the style information, the style attributes took effect. So I've got the change in the background, I changed the font information dynamically on the fly, and then down here I was able to pick up the word count. And then similarly also, if I print out the browser info, you can see the main thing is I successfully dumped out the initialization information. So I was able to get those startup arguments passed down into managed code and very easily pull them out the other end. And of course, the other thing that I didn't touch on was my super snazzy animation effect. Just a quick FYI, we do have a managed wrapper for the timer object that's in all of the different browsers. So if you poke around a little bit, you'll see there's a type, I think it's called HTML timer, and that's actually a way that you can get the same effect in managed code that you could from JavaScript calling something like the set interval method on the window object. So I know that we've gotten questions before, even internally, like, hey, how can I do some stuff in the background? That HTML timer type right now in the alpha, that's a way to do it on the, synchronized with the UI thread in the browser. Quick FYI on that is it works great for sort of low resolution stuff, but please don't go out and try to do high resolution timer manipulations in WPF with it. It's basically just a very simple managed wrapper around the set interval method, and it's not really suitable for sort of video sync and more advanced things like that. So okay, let's switch back to the Windows laptop. And what I'll do now is jump back into the deck, and we'll talk briefly about the other direction of HTML interop. So everything I just showed you were some examples of managed code reaching out into the DOM. Now let's take it in the other direction. Let's talk about you're the JavaScript developer and you have some interesting stuff locked up in your managed code that you'd actually like to call into. So we refer to this as the scriptable feature. It's patterned after the name of the actual attribute, which is scriptable. And the whole point of it is to give you a way to call into managed code from JavaScript, and in many cases, for you to be able to make use of managed code without necessarily having any kind of XAML-based UI. So it may be a little bit funny to bring that up, since obviously we've done a lot of talks about the great media effects and the great animation effects you can get in XAML, but it's actually an important point that for a lot of the framework libraries that we have, like for example, if you want to do complex web service calls, or like you saw in the chess sample, if you want to go out and do all of the chess computations, things like that, there's a lot of utility in writing that kind of code inside of C#, VB.NET, DLR languages, and it doesn't necessarily require you to go out and have a beautiful XAML-based UI. So what this allows you to do is sort of build up libraries of complex functionality, expose them through the scriptable feature, and then your JavaScript developers just see this stuff sort of showing up as an extension to the DOM that's being projected out by the Silverlight control. So there are a couple of ways to make use of it. In general, what you do is you take this attribute and you go stick it on the class or classes that you would like to expose out to your JavaScript developers. You also have to individually attribute properties, methods, and events. And that's how we know at runtime specifically which subset of your type signature should actually be getting projected out into the browser. And then what you do is you call a method to explicitly tell us that there's a specific managed type instance that you want to have accessible from the browser. And once that happens, your JavaScript developer can go out and code against the managed code using the content property. So you've probably seen it from the demos where you do JavaScript coding against the XAML DOM. You always have a reference to your Silverlight control, and then there's this content property underneath which all kinds of XAML DOM elements exist. What happens in the alpha is when you go out and tell us, hey, go make this managed code available to JavaScript developers, one of the other things you tell us is what's sort of this string accessor that should be available for the JavaScript developer. And in this case, I've got it highlighted. It's called my custom endpoint. The point is it's a string that you can make up. You can use any old string. And then your developers in JavaScript just type in the control reference, .content, whatever it is you told us. And then underneath that are all of the properties and the methods and the events that you want exposed. So it's a pretty simple thing from the point of view of the JavaScript developers to just code right in and bang, they have immediate access to whatever you set up for managed code. Now in terms of type support for what works in the Silverlight Alpha, right now there are a few basic types that we've enabled. So you'll find ints, doubles, and strings all work fine. And then you can actually use scriptable object, for example, for either an input parameter or a return value. And again, as we move through stuff here into the CTPs and the betas, we just have a few bugs kicking around that we'll flesh out, and we'll fill out the support for other types. Also, right now in the alpha, and I'll actually show it to you in a few minutes, you can use JSON as a very simple way to tunnel complex types back and forth across the boundary of managed code and JavaScript. And so, for example, in my case, I happen to have the ASP.NET AJAX product running on my machine, and that means that I can very easily do JSON serialization in the browser, deserialize it in managed code because we have a JSON serializer in the Silverlight framework, and that way I can actually start using very complex types today. Now, and it's sort of an advanced feature that's available inside of the scriptable feature, which is when you attribute a managed event with the scriptable attribute, it turns out that you can use events sort of today in the alpha as what I'd call a poor man's way of having managed code just call arbitrary JavaScript methods. And the reason for that is you can actually create a custom event argument type. This is, again, in managed code. And then you can put all kinds of properties and, if you want, methods on it. And then what will end up happening is when you fire the event back out into the browser, it's sort of like the equivalent of passing a bunch of input parameters into a JavaScript method. And that's actually the thing I'll walk through with you here in a minute or so. And then again, just to sort of reiterate, we're at an alpha, so we by no means have fleshed out all the type support or all the more complex interactions. What you will actually end up seeing in the future is you'll be able to do some crazy things like be able to pass JavaScript objects from JavaScript into a scriptable managed method, and then be able to dynamically invoke methods on that JavaScript object right back out. So it'll be pretty cool stuff as we build it up. Okay, so I'll switch back over to Visual Studio, and I'll take a look at my other page for the scriptable sample. And what I wanted to show you here, just stepping through in this talk, is the more advanced scenario of having a scriptable event argument. And I've also got buried in here sort of the simpler things like, hey, how do I do a scriptable property and a scriptable method? If you happen to go to Jamie and Nick's talks on that, you've probably seen that already. So what I want to do here is basically I'd like to use managed code to go out and sort a set of JavaScript objects. And actually, if I pull it up here, I can show you just sort of the sample I'm using. So this is JavaScript. I've just got some JSON with an array of JavaScript objects that have a first name and a last name property. And what I'd like to do is, this is sitting over in JavaScript. I'd actually like to sort it over in managed code on the last name and then pipe the results back out to JavaScript so I can go display it. So what I've done, first off, is I've set up a few scriptable entry points. Now again, this is mainly just for demo purposes so you understand how scriptable events work. But what I did is I created first a scriptable property. And the idea here is the JavaScript developer is going to give me a JSON serialized representation of that complex type. And they're going to go set it on the scriptable property. And that gets the data from JavaScript into the managed world. And then what will happen is when I click on one of my buttons, and that actually will fire a managed event handler, what's going to occur is after I sort everything inside of managed code, I'm going to turn right around and I'm going to JSON serialize the sorted array and I'm going to fire it back out into JavaScript by raising the event that I've got highlighted here. And the reason why that's going to work is that even though this is an event inside of managed code, right, what are events inside of the .NET framework? They're basically function pointers. They're function delegates. And so what that means is from JavaScript, you can take a JavaScript method. It can be a global method. It can be an instance method. And you can actually set that as the value of this event handler. And as long as it's got the conforming signature, you know, the sender and the arguments, we can then from managed code go out and invoke that JavaScript method to our heart's content. So this is just sort of what I've got set up inside of managed code. There's something very important that I wanted to go over, though, which is the synchronization process you need to go through when using the scriptable feature. And the reason why I bring that up is that even though we're sitting here on a local machine and everything's high speed, you'd probably never run into this, right? But in the real world, everyone does not run on 10 and 100 megabit Ethernet connections and certainly not on the internet. So you know you've probably run into this before with other aspects of HTML programming. There's a little bit of a race condition. I'm in JavaScript, I'd like to invoke the scriptable method. But wait a second, did the Silverlight control actually get loaded yet? Is it initialized? Is it safe for me to call? So like, how do I actually make sure that when I'm in JavaScript and I try to call into the control, the thing's actually there? Maybe it's still being downloaded over, you know, my old 56K modem. So there's a very straightforward sort of a pattern for dealing with that. And what I've done first off is inside of the JS code where I'm actually spinning up the control, you'll notice again I'm using one of the optional properties, and in this case I'm saying, hey, guess what? On the control, I'd like to subscribe to the onload event. So this is JavaScript. And what will happen is when the control is loaded, Silverlight will raise this event back out into JavaScript into the global onload method. And this can be any old method. I mean, this just happens to be the name I picked for it. And you can see I've got the implementation of it here on my page. So what's nice about this method is that the sender parameter is actually the reference back to the Silverlight control. And so what I can do in this case is I'm actually storing this as a global variable, and I'm sort of using it as a guard variable. And even though I'm not going to run the code in this sample, if I scroll down a bit, you can see, for example, here how I'm using it. So I'm going out and I'm saying, hey, if you happen to have clicked, like in this case, there's a button that's hooked up to this JavaScript method. Hey, if you actually want to go call into scriptable code, make sure that the Silverlight control has actually been initialized. And oh, by the way, if it wasn't, go do something else. In this case, I'm firing an alert. Maybe in a real application, you'd go queue the operation back onto a timer and then try it maybe every 500 milliseconds. But this is sort of the correct way of making sure that, hey, the control actually exists. And then in my case, I'm taking advantage of the fact that, hey, since I'm in the load event, you must exist. In this case, I'm coding into my control reference. I'm going into that content property. And then in my case, what I've done for this sample is I've said, go take that managed code and go make it available off of a sub-property called example. And again, it's completely up to you. You have the freedom to pick whatever value you want for this. And you can see what I've done for the value to sort is I've used... Yep. Okay. So what I've done here is use the ASP.NET Ajax 1.0 client-side framework. So I'm using a JavaScript framework and the JavaScript serializer that's built into that. And I'm going out and I'm serializing that array of JavaScript objects. So I've now bundled everything up into a string. The other thing that, again, looks a little bit weird at first is remember that value sorted property in managed code is actually an event? Well, look at what I'm setting it to, right? I'm setting it, in this case, to a global method with a conforming sender argument parameter list. And so that's the way that I've basically been able to prime my managed type with the necessary information that I want to sort and with the callback. So if I flip back over to managed code, what actually ends up happening is when I click one of the buttons, it's going to call into this method, trigger event-based sort. And now what I'm using is I'm picking up the JavaScript serializer, in this case, that's in the managed code framework. So if you look under the System Windows Browser serialization namespace, you'll see that what we've done for the alpha is we picked up the managed JavaScript serializer that shipped in Ajax 1.0, and we basically cloned it right over into the Silverlight framework. There are a few tweaks we had to make underneath the hood just because, right, it's a subset of the .NET framework that's in Silverlight, but it's for all practical purposes the exact same serializer. And I just take advantage of that fact in this case. This is where things get pretty funky, right? I'm in managed code, so I've got the full power of the framework. So now I'm deserializing it. I'm turning it into a strongly typed generic list. And when you look at the source code and download it, you'll see I've actually got a little type called person. So great, I'm taking JSON, I'm coercing it onto a strong .NET type. And then I'm taking advantage of the fact that, great, I've got generics. I can actually do some funky things like custom comparisons. So I've actually got a custom comparer for the person object in managed code that can sort on last name instead of, for example, first name or something else. And then when I'm all done, I reserialize that list and I package it up in a custom event argument. And you can see right here, this is where the rubber hits the road. I now fire the event back out into JavaScript, giving it the custom event argument that happens to include the sorted list of information. One thing to keep in mind, just like you can attribute your methods and your properties and your events with scriptable, you can do the same thing with event arguments. So you see I've derived from event args, I've attributed my custom event arguments with scriptable, and I've gone out and I've attributed the individual value with scriptable. And the net result is back out in my HTML page, you can see that when I get the arguments back out from managed code, I'm actually able to index into that event type, pull out the extra value. That's the property that I marked that has the JSON serialized list of sorted information. And now in this case, it happens to be JSON, so I just eval it away, and then I go out and I display it. So let's switch over to the Mac at this point, and let's see that code running. Okay. We there? All right. So we'll pull up the scriptable example. So you can see, great, the page is initialized, nothing too earth-shattering. I just dumped out the before image of the array of JavaScript objects. And now in this case, the bottom button on the page is what I use to actually use scriptable events to trigger the sort. And bang, in a split second when I get out the other side, same set of information, but now you can see it's actually sorted in alphabetical order using the last name property. And then some of the other things I didn't walk through it there. Again, you can download it all in the sample. I've got some sample code that just shows, yeah, the hello world, you can go call a scriptable method. And that's probably the most common way people will start using this feature initially. And then also I have a simpler event sample that just shows how you can go out and raise events again back out from managed code into JavaScript. So hopefully you get an idea there of just how powerful the scriptable feature is currently in the alpha. And like I said, we'll be certainly improving the type support as we move on. Probably the most interesting thing is, right now what I showed you, you have to use sort of a JavaScript serializer on either side, managed in JavaScript, to be able to move complex types back and forth. And what we'll be doing again in future releases prior to the RTM is cleaning that up a bit so that you don't actually have to go out and write all that kind of code. We'll come up with semantics so that you can either do by value or by ref, in essence, remoting of these complex types across the managed native boundary. Okay, so let's switch back to the Windows machine at this point. Okay. And we'll move on to the next topic, which is I wanted to drill in a little bit more on web services. So, of course, by now you've probably seen it, in some of the various talks, being able to add in web service references, things like that. I just wanted to touch a little bit on specifically the kinds of things we support, and then again drill into a little bit of a more advanced scenario. So what we're currently shipping in the alpha will work with web services that are exposed as JSON endpoints using ASP.NET Ajax 1.0. So that's the Ajax product that we formally RTM'd just a few months ago towards the end of January. I also noted here it works as well with Orcus. It's probably not immediately obvious, but there's basically like a refresh and an integration of Ajax 1.0 into the core framework that happens in Orcus. So if you happen to install Orcus Beta 1, you've got like the updated version of Ajax 1.0. We work with that. And then also what's pretty cool is that Windows Communication Foundation in Orcus, in the Beta 1 bits that you've all got, they added support for JSON as a type. And so again, we can also work with WCF endpoints in Orcus Beta 1 that have the JSON protocol turned on. In terms of the types that we support, like I said earlier, because basically we're using the exact same serializer that we shipped back in Ajax 1.0, you've basically got the span of all the complex types you can think of. So primitives, strings, your own custom types, arrays, lists, dictionaries thereof, all the obvious things where JSON and .NET have very natural mappings back and forth. You can remote those back and forth over web service connections. The one, the FYI, is when you look at the type signature for the JavaScript serializer in Silverlight, you'll see that we did carry over all of the extensibility points for things like custom type converters and such. We didn't have a chance to test that, so let us know if it works, great, but there may actually be a few bugs kicking around in there. Now, underneath the hood, when you see folks up on stage and they go add web reference and like, poof, hey, this thing shows up, wow, where did that come from? Well, what's happening currently underneath the hood is we do something a little bit funky. What we did is we took the WSDL exe program that's available in all of the various versions of the .NET framework, and we basically, our devs went out and created a customized version of it. If you root around a little bit on the file system, if you've installed Orcus Beta 1 and you drill down a bit, the binary actually exists and you can invoke it from the command line as well as visually from inside of the tool. And what we did is we stripped it down and we compiled it against a custom sort of version of the system web services assembly. And the reason for that is, of course, in the full .NET framework, there's full support for SOAP, and everything is rigged in sort of with the assumption of the SOAP protocol. And what we did is we created a custom version where if you use the Silverlight client switch, we basically switch over and we say, oh, go use these sort of stubbed out, quote-unquote, SOAP implementations of the protocol that really do JSON. So if you happen to be running this tool from the command line, or for example, if you poke around a bit and look at the proxies that we generate and you happen to see the word SOAP all over the place, again, it's an alpha, so I know it looks a little bit weird, but trust me, underneath the hood, it's JSON that's flowing back and forth over the wire. Now, what we do is when we generate the proxy, inside of the client-side Silverlight framework, we have, of course, the internal implementation of this type called SOAP HTTP client protocol. And like I said earlier, intuitively, it has nothing to do with SOAP in the Silverlight client framework. It's just called that way. And what we do is we always submit the web service requests with a post verb. We always set up the content type header, and that's necessary because, right, the ASP.NET backend support for JSON as well as WCF expect this special header to be there. And then we always serialize and deserialize types up on the client using our JavaScript serializer. The other nice thing is we are able to retain support for both synchronous and asynchronous calls. And the reason why that works is underneath the hood, all of the web service stack sits on top of the Silverlight system.NET namespace. And if you've poked around a bit in the framework, you know in the current .NET framework in system.NET, there are things like HTTP web request, HTTP web response, right? Those are base types. And we have implementations of those in Silverlight that actually sit on top of the XML HTTP object that's available in all the browsers. And so what's nice about that is you know today, right, XML HTTP web request has an async model that it supports. And by us just sort of slipping the managed API set for the system.NET namespace right on top of XML HTTP request, we basically get the async support for free. What's also good about that is as developers, when you're writing managed code and you're inside of, for example, the completion event for an asynchronous web service call, you don't need to worry about, am I on the UI thread or am I not on the UI thread? Right? You're always guaranteed that your web service calls and your network calls will complete on the main UI thread of the browser, and that means it's safe to then turn right around and go touch WPF UI objects or go touch HTML objects that are out in the browser. So what I'm going to show you in source code, though, is not just sort of the generic, hey, let's go hook up a web service. because like I said, I figured by now you've seen that a million times. What I wanted to do was just sort of touch on how you could take the Silverlight client stack and point it at some of the application services that shipped inside of ASP.NET Ajax. So you know there was a profile service that shipped, an authentication service, so you could call those from the client, and I believe in the Orcus Beta 1 product we added support for a role service. So right now, again, it's an alpha and things are a little bit rough, but by the same token, there's a sort of straightforward way to pull it off. So what you can do is you can generate an arbitrary web service proxy, just go point it at like a hello world, just so that you get splatted out the C# or the VB.NET code that you want. And then what you can do is you can tweak up the class and put in the correct type information and the correct parameter information. And then at that point, you've basically got a custom rolled proxy that can talk to, for example, here I've got the endpoints for the profile and the authentication service. What I'll do is switch over to Visual Studio and show you that. Basically, I've got an application here that's fully built out that's like a little stock chart application. I think if you went to some of Nikhil's talks, you probably saw it before. But what I've done is, let me go out and include this proxy in the project. What I did earlier was clone out basically the web service proxy that I had for calling my stock service, and I tweaked it up and turned it into a profile service. And so you can see I've got the AXD handler reference that points back to the profile service. And if you've played around a bit with Ajax 1.0 using profiles purely client side, you'll know you can do things like get properties for a user, and then you can do other things in reverse, setting a subset of properties for the user. And so again, even though it looks like a whole bunch of code, in essence, all I did was say, hey, guess what? I've got to get the return value correct. I've got to get the input parameter and change that around. And then because underneath the hood everything gets invoked sort of in a generic manner, I have to also tweak up the service parameter references and the return values. Now the URL that I showed you guys earlier, and at the end of the talk I'll park us back on that screen, I've got all of this source code up on my website for the MIX talk. So you don't actually, hopefully at least for profile, you won't have to go through this yourselves. You can just download the sample code, rip this C# right out, and bang, you've got yourself a proxy back to the profile service. So that's how I built it underneath the hood. Let's actually rig it into my application. So first off, I'll just uncomment my reference to the service. And the way this application works is what I'd like to be able to do is it allows you to search for various stock data, though admittedly it has a whopping total right now of Microsoft and Google stock data running on my laptop. But what I'd like to do is have a way to remember what stock symbol I typed in up in the browser, go store that in my server-side profile, and then be able to pull that back out and use that to initialize the state of the Silverlight application when I subsequently navigate back to the app. So what I'll do is I'll start popping in some code in various places. The first thing I'm going to do is this happens to be the completion event for after I've gotten my stock quote data back. And you can see here I'm getting back an array of stock quote from the asynchronous completion event. So we'll go out and we'll just drop in some extra code that makes a call in to the profile service to actually store the stock symbol that I just went out and searched on. And I'll also have to drop in the implementation of it. So this is the first place where I'm actually making use of that profile proxy. So you can see I new up an instance of my profile service. And remember what I mentioned earlier about startup arguments being a useful way of passing in initialization data? Well, once again, I'm using the web app type right here. I'm drilling into my startup arguments, and I'm pulling up the profile URL. And if we take a look at the code, the JavaScript code that I used to start the page, you'll see I created my init params, and you can see here I've actually got two things. I've got the service URL back to my stock quote web service, and then over here, here's the URL back to my profile web service. And this should be pretty familiar to those of you who played around with web services in the .NET framework. You know you can sort of externalize your web service URLs in config. This is sort of the same general concept, just doing it client-side using the JavaScript initialization arguments. So I've got my URL set up. This is just then sort of the standard code for packaging up the input parameters. In this case, I'm actually storing the information, and just the way the Ajax 1.0 profile service works, you give it this sort of generic dictionary of just string keys and then a bunch of whatever. And we sort of on the other side on the web service on ASP.NET say, oh, you gave me a JSON object. I'll go sort of figure out what I can turn that into based on your server-side profile. And then I go out and I make the call, in this case synchronously, to go store the data in the profile service. So that's sort of the storage side of the house. Let's see what I do pulling it out the other side. So now I'm in the canvas load event, and this is where I'd actually like to pull the profile symbol back out. So we'll go out and we'll insert a call to a method that can do that, and then we'll drop in the implementation. So let's go out and drop in our code for calling the profile service to get the stock symbol. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm using the asynchronous call syntax. So I've got a profile service, and I'm saying, hey, I'm going to begin to try to get the properties and specifically get me the stock symbol. And then, oh, by the way, when you're actually complete, let's go pull the value back out of the stock service, and then at that point I turn around and I say, fine, go call back to the server and go get the stock quote data. So let's go out and save this. Go out and build it. Okay, so we compiled fine, and now let's switch over to the Mac. Can I get the screen switched over to the Mac, please? Okay, there we go. So, all right, let's go ahead and fire up this little stock charting application. So hopefully what should happen is first time round I pull up the page. Be a little bit of a pause because it's just calling into the profile service, and of course, great, I'm just starting out clean. There is no data sitting back in my profile. So right now I've just sort of got this empty page, and we'll go out and we'll say, wonderful, let's go search and let's retrieve some stock data for the Microsoft stock symbol. So what I just did there, it might have flickered by too quickly. I just made a call to a WCF web service running on my Windows laptop, pulled back around 300 rows of stock quote data, and just popped it up here. And what we had is we had some of our developers just sort of mock this up, so you can actually hover the mouse over the different elements of the stock chart, and then again you can look at the source code when you download it from the site, but we also use the HTML interop feature so that we can dynamically update that little table that you see off to the right hand side with all of the open, the close, that kind of stuff. All right. Thanks. So, okay, we've got it running. You saw that I pulled up the Microsoft stock symbol. Let's go out and I'll just copy the URL, shut down that instance of the browser. We'll pull it back up again. I'll paste in the same URL. And now this time around, what should end up happening is when the page comes back up, is we should go out and make a call to the profile service, automatically pick up the fact that it was the Microsoft stock symbol, and then the page should actually pop up. And the reason, of course, now that I'm getting bitten by this demo is underneath the hood, the JavaScript for putting the Silverlight on the page is frantically looking at my dead-end hub trying to find the Microsoft com site so it can resolve all of the little forward links. But trust me, we'll sit here and wait for it to eventually come back up. The other thing that we'll do while we're waiting for it to chug through is when I get back onto the Windows machine is we'll pull up isolated storage, and we'll sort of walk through doing the same kind of stuff, but this time going out and storing the data locally in storage. So, okay, we got through my little DNS issues, and you can see this time around the page came up. I didn't do anything to it. It automatically initialized itself and said, oh, hey, guess what? You already stored the Microsoft stock symbol back in your profile. It automatically pulled it out. Again, it sort of flickers too quickly for you to see it there, but it got that symbol out, went back to the web server, and it automatically initialized the stock chart to the value that I wanted. So hopefully it gives you an idea. Even though we're still early days here in the alpha, you can actually build some pretty complex interactions, both in terms of the UI and also in terms of the kinds of things you can do with calling back to your servers, calling into your web services and your application services. Okay, let's switch back to the Windows machine right now. And what I'd like to do next is touch on the ISO store feature. So first we'll just talk through it for one slide, and then we'll switch into the code. So isolated storage is something new that's in the Silverlight client-side framework. The general idea is to be able to give you a way to sort of get beyond the storage limitations of client-side cookies. And certainly we've all played sort of tricks where we say, well, you know, maybe I can store 4K of data in a client-side cookie, and then you start trying to figure out, well, just what are the things that I actually want to store there? And I mean, that works up to a point, but if somebody actually wants to say, I want to store my shopping cart client-side, it's unlikely you're going to manage to cram that into a cookie. So isolated storage in Silverlight is about getting beyond those limitations. Now, for some of you who've poked around more in the .NET framework into some of the dustier corners of it, you might recognize the name of this feature because the .NET framework, the full one that you run on the desktop in the framework, also has something called isolated storage. And in essence, what this feature is we took isolated storage as it was implemented in the .NET framework and basically refactored it, picked it up, and plopped it down into the Silverlight client framework. So what you get today in the alpha is you get stream-based access to basically an arbitrary and virtual file and directory structure that you end up creating. And even though today in the alpha it's all stream-based, what we will be doing in future iterations is we'll clip on top of that much easier dictionary-oriented accessors. So you'll see in the code that I show you in a few minutes there's a lot of open file, close file, you know, write stream, read stream. It's pretty powerful, but also in a lot of cases all you really want to do is say, look, I got 3 things, go store it somewhere and be done with it. And we will add those facades on in future iterations. So what can you do with IsoStore? Well, you can manipulate string data, you can manipulate binary data. What we do is we put, currently in the alpha, it's a hard-coded 1 megabyte limit, and the way the limit is computed right now is we just sort of use the application identity, and what I mean by that is the full URL to the XAML file that's actually being loaded up inside of the Silverlight control. And again, what we'll do is, as we move past the alpha here, is we'll actually relax that a bit and have ways that you can actually share the IsoStore across, for example, virtual directories underneath a common host name. The other thing, of course, that we'll do is right now we just sort of pick 1 meg as, well, that's probably a reasonable limit right now for the alpha. And again, prior to RTM, we will build in ways, for example, so if you're behind maybe a corporate firewall, you could have a corporate policy that says, hey, guess what? I actually want the default IsoStore limit to be 200 kilobytes. And we'll also have a way that a user can, you know, if they actually understand what isolated storage is, they'd be able to go in and say, oh, well, you know something, for this site, I actually want a higher or a lower limit. So you will see those things come out in future versions. In terms of where stuff gets stored, it doesn't get stored in the browser cache. It gets stored outside of the browser cache, but it gets stored on a per-user basis. So for example, on Windows, if you want to sleuth around a little bit and you look under like Documents and Settings, or on Vista it's under Users, if you find like your user directory and you drill down a bit, there's a hidden app data folder. Inside of there you'll actually see the root node for the isolated storage, and then there's a bunch of funky hashed directory names that we actually use underneath the hood, and that's the thing that gets created each time you open up and create files. And then similarly on the Mac, they also, of course, have the concept of like a user-specific directory structure. And again, if you drill down there, there's like a Microsoft folder, and underneath that, you'll also see there's an isolated storage folder, and that's where we create the data on the Mac. So the nice thing there is you fire something up in Safari on the Mac, you go store some stuff in the IsoStore, you switch over to Firefox, it's still there and available for you. And it's the same kind of deal over on Windows. So I'll switch over to Visual Studio right now. We'll go back to the exact same application, and what I'm going to do this time around is I'll comment out the code that was using the profile, and what we'll do instead is we'll make use of the IsoStore. Oh, please switch me back to the Windows machine. Sorry, guys. Yes, Visual Studio magically morphed into the Mac. Whoops. Okay. Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. You just missed me going out and commenting out code. So, okay, let's go out and add in, basically I want to add in code that can take all of that return data. Like I said, on my little sample, it's around 300 rows of stock data that come back. Let's go out and store that in the IsoStore each time I make my query, and then have the ability to automatically pull it back out and use it to initialize the app when I pull up my page. So what we'll do first is add in some code to actually store the data inside of the IsoStore. So in this case, once again, I'm in the completion method where I got back all my stock quote data. And this is sort of the general way that you interact with the IsoStore. The first thing you do is you use the isolated storage file type. So that's underneath the system IO namespace. And you basically call the method to say, give me a handle to the isolated storage. And underneath the hood, we'll figure out for this user, for this application, what's the actual correct location on the file system where you can read and write stuff. And then once I've got it, like I said, everything uses a file stream metaphor. So you always end up creating an isolated storage file stream. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, on the file system, I want to create a text file. Go open it if it already exists, because that'll let me override it. And if it doesn't exist, go create it for me automatically. And then the last thing here is, again, this is just sort of an artifact of the current porting effort from the .NET framework. You have to sort of pass in the handle that you just got in the previous line of code. So like I said, we'll do fit and finish on the API so they're a bit cleaner, but you get the idea. I get a file stream, I open up my text file in my ISO store, and now I can start partying on it. So in this case, all I'm doing is, once again, I'm using my, my JSON serializer, and I'm going out and I'm serializing up this huge array of quotes. And then given this stream writer, so this is reading and writing strings, I go out and I write the symbol into the ISO store, and then I write that whole big chunk of stock data into the ISO store. And then just from a safe coding practice, I make sure I close out the file stream in the ISO store, in this case in a finally block. So at this point, I've written everything into the store. Now what I'd like to do is pull it back out the other side. So let's go back to my page loaded event. And then let's drop some code in there to actually pull the data out of the ISO store. So once again, great, I get a handle to my ISO store. And in this case, in the alpha, it's a little bit awkward, but what I'm doing right now is I'm saying, hey, go check and see whether or not I previously cached any information. And the way I do it is I'm using this get file names method, which is basically, it's a way to search inside of your store and say, can you find me a file name called foo? And in this case, I'm saying, go find me the stock text file that I created. And assuming it exists, once again, I get myself a file stream. You can see in this case, I'm only opening it. I don't want to create it because I know it already exists. And again, I get a stream reader. So this is giving me the read access using strings. I read out my stock symbol. And then what I do is, with all of the stock data, I read it out, and using the JavaScript support in Silverlight, I immediately deserialize that sucker into an array of stock quotes. And then, great, I can go off and I can go render it on the screen. So let's go out and once again rebuild the project. Okay, so that looks like it succeeded. So let's switch over to the Macintosh. All right, so this time around, let's go out and refresh the page. Great, it looks like it picked up the new version of my app, so you can see now, once again, it's like, hey, I have no idea what you want to be looking at. So let's go out and, in this case, we'll retrieve the Google data. So great. Now at this point, everything should actually be stored inside of the browser, inside of the ISO store that we created. So let's actually, in this case, I'll be adventurous and I'll pull up Firefox. I'll pull up the page, and you can see what happened there. Right, bang, it came up and it automatically initialized itself to Google. So remember what I said earlier? Yep. So like I said earlier, that's why the store is sort of independent of the browser. So I initialized it over in Safari, and I was able to automatically pull it out the other side from inside of Firefox. So okay, that's sort of it for the stock client sample. Again, can't stress it enough. I've got that link up there that I'll pull up when I'm done with the talk, so you can download all this source code, pull it apart. I admit I'm not a designer, so I depended upon my other devs to actually do all the XAML visualizations, but that's also in there for you guys to tear apart, look at, and play around with. So at this point, let's switch back to the Windows machine, and we'll cover the last topic. So for this one, I'll just stay basically in source mode, and we'll flip over to another sample I've got. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was another new feature that's in the Silverlight client framework that's called the Open File Dialog. And the idea here is, as we build up more complex Silverlight applications, right, we want to be able to give you folks a way to be able to take data that the customer is willing to let you touch, pull it up into memory, go manipulate it, and then again, maybe you'll render it or you'll ship it up to the server. And so for this demo, what we did is we created a little file upload application, primarily because one of the most frustrating things I've found over the past few years is that every time you want to upload a file from your client machine to the web server, you're either left with this comparatively crappy, HTML upload control that's in every browser, or you end up having to like buy an ActiveX control, or maybe you're using SharePoint or a third-party product. And it's sort of like, well, you know, after 10 years, why don't we just have this in every single browser? So we had our devs sort of put together a little project that uses the open file dialog, lets you pick one or more files from the local file system, and then it goes out and it uses our network stack underneath the hood to encode them and then ship them up to a little web service that we have running on the server. So before we actually try it out, let's just talk about the open file dialog type, which is what sort of makes this all work. So this is a control that sits, I think it's in the System Windows Controls namespace in the Silverlight managed framework. You can see with the next few lines of code here what you can do before you open it. You can flip the dialog into single select or multi-select mode. You can give us a filter, and we've done some work so that at least common filters sort of show up the same way regardless of whether you're on the Windows or whether you're using a Mac. And then, of course, the title so people know what they're actually doing. Now, underneath the hood, we've actually rigged this into sort of the native operating system implementations of the file dialog. So what I mean by that is if you happen to be on XP, you'll get the XP file dialog. If you're on Vista, you get the newer Vista file dialog. And of course, if you're on a Mac, you get the Mac version of a file dialog. So people see the OS-specific version of the file dialog. What we didn't do, for example, is we didn't go out and like write a custom file dialog that's completely looks the same across all browsers. And the reason for that is I think it's a common enough sort of UI interaction. Customers on a Mac expect to see the Mac file dialog. They don't expect to see some bizarre thing that, you know, just looks the same on a bunch of different OSs. So you get the OS look and feel. So once you've actually got an open file dialog, you go out and you show it. And then assuming the customer picked something and said OK, you get back, of course, the dialog result. And then the interesting thing is, OK, great, what do I do at that point? Like, what did I get back? And you can see in this line of code, there's a property called selected files. And what we give you back is this enumerable collection of references to each file that the customer selected. And it's a little bit of a long name, but each of those references, it's an instance of this file dialog file info class. And if we take a look at what you have on it, in the alpha, there are two critical things you get. You get a name, and then you get some open methods. So a couple of points to touch on here. First off, the open file dialog gives you, the developer, read-only access to the files that the customer picked. It does not enable in any way, shape, or form write access. So this is all about reading a file or a set of files that the customer said, I'm going to allow you to touch, doing something with it, and then, like I said, maybe you display data or you upload it to a server. The other kinds of things that we did for security purposes is when you get the name in code, all you're getting is actually just the file name. What we do is we strip off all of the directory info. So if I go out and I open a file that's in some super sensitive folder, though, you know, why I would be doing that in the app is probably a different question, but if I go out and I do that, what you, the developer, get in code is you just get, oh, you selected foo.txt. You have no idea that there's actually a path on the file system called, oh, c:/whack document and users, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff gets stripped off, and it's hidden, and it's not accessible to the code running in the browser. And then from there, you've got one of two options. You can open up that file as a string, basically using a string reader, or more precisely a string-based stream, or you can open it up as a binary stream. So you can do text-based file manipulations, and you can do binary file manipulations. And what we do in this sample is we open up all of the selected files in binary mode, and then there's a bunch of code, you know, grungy code farther down. Basically, we just base64 encode it, ship it up to a web service, we decode it, and then we go write it out on the file system. So now that you've seen sort of the salient parts of it, I just went out and rebuilt it. So let's switch back over to the Mac. And what I'll do now is I'll pull up my little file upload client. Oh, actually, one thing. Can you flip back to Windows for a sec? Sorry about that. So just to, you know, sort of full disclosure, this is the upload directory for my web service on my laptop. There's nothing in it, just that we all know. Great, there's nothing in it up front. Okay, let's switch back to the Mac. All right, now what we'll do is we'll pull up the client for the file upload application. Now, of course, like I said, you can tell I'm a developer, not a designer, and the great UI has a whopping 3 buttons. But the critical thing is I click my button there. I just fired the event into manage code that we were just looking at a second earlier. Great, I've actually got the look and feel that you would expect on the Mac. I've got the open file dialog that's appropriate. You you know, I can go surf around wherever on the file system. In my case, what I did ahead of time is in a user directory here, I uploaded a bunch of bitmap files. So I've got, I don't know, 5 different pictures. So I'll go out and multi-select that, and then I'll have each one of them update with progress notifications, and we'll wait for everything to complete there. So we just went out and we uploaded all the files, they're binary files from the Mac to the Windows. And now let's switch back over to the Windows machine. And sure enough, I've got 5 bitmap files, and they all came over in full fidelity, right? So we didn't go out and, you know, there's nothing tweaky going on with like dropping binary data or anything like that. So hopefully that gives you an idea of, even though it's a very simple type, thanks. Even though it's a very simple type to use, right? I mean, there's not a lot to it. You new it up, you set a file filter, you look at the files that come back, you open the streams and you do something with it. You can actually build some complex applications. And like I said, the source code is up there, so what I'm hoping is somebody with, you know, a lot more design experience than myself can actually make these things look a lot better, but hopefully it gives you the idea of like, you know, wow, you can actually start, again, building these kinds of applications today on top of the Silverlight Alpha. So with that done, what I'll do is I'll pull up the original slide again here, just so that folks, if you're wondering, you know, where you can download the code, that's where you can grab it from. Again, thank you for coming so early in the morning to this, and I'll be around for a few minutes. If folks have questions, just come up to the mic there and feel free to ask away.
So I had a question about the ISO storage stuff.
Sure.
You said it was per XAML file. Is it really per Silverlight instance, or?
Well, so currently in the alpha, we just did something very simple, and it's not. When I say per XAML file, what I really mean is it's per fully qualified URL, including the XAML file for that Silverlight app. So I mean, obviously, you come back to that same app tomorrow, you've got the same ISO store. But
right,
yes,
but if it had 100 XAML files in that one app, then you'd have 100 storage.
Then you would have 100 ISO stores. Yep, and that's where I pull out my card of it's an alpha, and there are some things that we still need to polish off. Okay. So that will change in the future. So it's not going to always be just per XAML file. It will instead be, and we still have to sort of play around with it. It may be per fully qualified host name, or we may instead give you a way to be able to say, well, actually share these virtual directories and put them all in the same ISO store. But it'll be something along those lines.
Yeah. And is there a way to share them across XAML files right now, or?
No, there's no way currently to do it, because underneath the hood, whenever we start up a Silverlight app, we have a bunch of startup code that you can't get into that basically says what's the identity of this application, and that's what the ISO store keys off of. So there isn't a way currently in the alpha to sort of subvert that or change that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
First, I want to say it's great. I mean, I love it.
All right, thanks.
And the question about the WCF services that you were calling, is it under the same permission conditions, I mean, security conditions, and XBAP means, you know, it's going to come and it will be restricted to HTTP binding, these kind of things, or is it a separate security model?
Well, so my understanding is everything in terms of the WCF support, it works the same way. It's just, it's the protocol that gets switched around. And actually what I can do here, and it's also up there, again, in the source code that you folks can download. So if I flip into the config, scroll down 50 million pages. Okay, so this is just where I set up the WCF service. The only thing that's different from like a regular SOAP-based web service is that there's this sort of new web script behavior and the new message encoding of JSON. So beyond that, it's still a standard HTTP call. It's still subject to whatever security restrictions that are there. But the one critical thing is, if you are looking for, like, does it have WS security, the answer is no. It's basically like any other browser call back to the server. I mean, if you're doing basic auth, that'll work. If you're doing Windows auth, if you've got cookies, they'll flow along. So that all works. But any of the special, like, advanced authentication stuff that you get, you need SOAP for that. And, of course, this isn't a SOAP stack up in the Silverlight client.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, are there plans for drag and drop support, for example, from outside the browser for file upload?
So, yeah, good question. Is there drag and drop support? Currently, no, not in the alpha. I honestly don't know if the Windows presentation folks, if they're going to be adding drag and drop support, but that's something I can ask them about. I'm not up to speed on what their plans are for the future.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
For the ISO storage, is there any security mechanism built in so that the user can't tamper with the files?
Or do we have to handle our own like encryption if we want to store any sensitive data?
Yeah, so so the question is there like any kind of built-in encryption? Currently, no, there's nothing in there. The only, the specific two protections that we have built in are one, of course, it's isolated, otherwise it wouldn't be of much use. The other thing is I didn't show it to you guys, but there are properties that give you the current size of the ISO store and the maximum size that's allowed in the ISO store, so that you at least as a coder can say, hey, am I or am I not going to overrun the limit? But in terms of like encryption, obfuscation, stuff like that, no. What you should assume is anything that you write to the ISO store, an enterprising user can find it on the file system and just look at it.
All right, so I have two questions. First, on the attribute scriptable.
Okay.
Do you get JavaScript IntelliSense on the scriptable objects?
That would be a great feature. The answer is no, currently not.
It would be a great feature. And also on the isolated storage, can you execute stuff from outside in the computer which have been previously stored in the isolated storage?
So the quick answer would be no, there's no way we would ever want to allow that. Of course, then the longer answer is this is an alpha, and that's actually an interesting attack vector that we haven't looked into.
All right.
Yeah, think about that some more. Currently, the way the loaders work for assemblies, right, you can either specify assemblies in XAML, so, okay, that's all fine. You can go out, and I don't know if folks have showed it, but you can just write your assembly, and if it references another assembly, so if A.dll references B.dll, right, just standard class library referencing, you can actually put B.dll on the server and we'll automatically load it up for you. So that'll work. But we don't actually have anything in the API surface area today that says load from ISO store and, oh, by the way, go turn it around and turn it into an assembly. So the closest you could do is you could load the file from the ISO store, but at that point you've got this binary stream of stuff. But I don't think you could do anything with it at that point.
Okay.
Thanks for the question, though. That's a good thought-provoking one.
How's it going? A couple questions as well. Do you see any future changes, implications from a code access security perspective, since Silverlight on the browser really kind of changes the playing field?
Yeah, so just in the interest of time, you'll notice if you download the slide deck, I didn't actually go through every single slide, but one of the ones that I hid, and let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay, well, I've got it buried in here somewhere, but I touched briefly on code access security for Silverlight, which is substantially simplified from what you know in the .NET framework. It's actually very simple. You're either trusted platform code or we don't trust you at all. And so in essence, like the WPF, the XAML parser, that's trusted. The ISO store code, that's trusted. When I loaded up everything on my Mac and went out and ran that, that's all untrusted. And it's literally, that is as simple as the boundary is. There's no concept of like extensive permission hierarchies and demands and all this other stuff. Okay. So anything that actually gets loaded in from the internet, or I mean, it could even be from the file system. We don't even have like intranet versus internet zone. It's just basically if we loaded the code on your behalf and ran it in the browser, you can't p-invoke. And you'll also notice that you may run into it. There are a bunch of APIs that are publicly available, but if you actually try to touch them at runtime, they'll blow up with security permissions. So that's the other thing.
So it's not
there are a lot of sensitive APIs that you'll see, but you're not allowed to call.
Okay, and then second question is, so, you know, I'm a user, I go out to an ASP.NET site that maybe is just serving the purpose of hosting a Silverlight application. I click download, I already have the plugin installed. Where are the DLLs and the actual runtime? On disk or in memory or? Right,
so the Silverlight runtime, of course, I mean, today you guys can download the MSI. In the future, of course, that'll change over time, so it'll be, you know, go to some magical page and it comes off at downloadmicrosoft.com, but that'll already be on your client machine. So what you, like on a hoster or on a hosted machine, you're not going to put like the Silverlight client runtime on it. You'll just put in the links, and that's actually one of the reasons why the Mac stalled out there earlier is we've already got links in there in the JavaScript that point people at a download page. Eventually that'll just be an automatic download, but that'll just happen. Then in terms of the code that you wrote, like, okay, so you actually wrote the Silverlight application. You just take your .dlls. If you happen to be a developer, you can also put your PDBs out there for debugging purposes. They're just like ASPX or HTML files. You don't even have to tell your host or anything. you just dump them like wherever. And I think right now in our project structure, we have a little client bin that just happens to be where we stick it. But there's nothing magical about that. It's just, to us, it's a static file like anything else.
But are those artifacts like being loaded in like the temporary ASP.NET like
No,
bin,
that's the whole thing. Like Silverlight, when we say it's a pure client stack, I mean, we mean literally it's a pure client stack. If you want to go run, if you're running Unix, like Amazon could go out today, they could go write Silverlight apps, go stick them on their Unix boxes, no problem. There's zero dependency on ASP.NET on the back end.
Okay.
I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'm just curious, like, where are the artifacts? Like, where are the artifacts being, like, shoved on the client? So I go and I download the application.
Okay. I see what you mean. Okay, so on the client, when you download the XAML file into, IE Safari, and you download the DLLs and the PDBs, again, it's the same thing. It's like any other static file, just show up in the browser cache.
Okay.
That's appropriate for, that URL.
Right on. Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
Hi, my question is regarding the ISO stores. You got a
Okay.
1 megabyte limit. Is there some mechanism for data management like expiration so you can free up
Right.
space in them over time?
Yeah, so the answer there is there's a bunch more management-related stuff, including, for example, like how do you clear the cache, how do you automatically age the cache. None of that's just built in today, again, because it's early in the alpha. But yeah, we will be adding ways so that just like, customers are familiar today with, hey, there's a browser cache, I can clear it, it's got expiration dates, right? We'll be adding on all those semantics. It's just, it'll take us a little bit of time to get it in there.
Okay, now I have a second question regarding a complex application consisting of multiple pages
Okay.
with different instances of Silverlight, on each page.
Right.
What would be the mechanism for data persistence, since you would have a different ISO store for each instance?
Right. So the thing is, like I said, today, just because it's an alpha, the ISO store just happened. We ended up just saying, okay, initially, fine, just lock it down to the XAML file. That was just more a matter of expediency to say, okay, well,
Okay.
that'll work for the next month. Again, we will relax that. I mean, at this point, what I don't know is somewhere between saying there's one ISO store per host domain, which would probably work for, like, if it were just my own site, but that would really suck for, like, Microsoft.com.
Right.
Somewhere between that extreme and, it's per app, we'll have some way to be able to say, okay, well, like, say, hey, this collection of virtual directories starting at, /foo/bar, go stick that all in the same ISO store. Again, there, we just have to work through the design, and much more importantly, we have to sort of puzzle out the security implications of it. But there will be a way to relax that so that you can pull off what you're trying to do. Okay?
The managed Silverlight code gets compiled into a DLL, right?
Yeah, right. Everything gets pulled into a DLL, and like, for example, you can go out and use like ILDASM or Lutz's Reflector to go out and you can just tear the things apart and look inside of them.
But doesn't IIS block downloads of DLLs?
So the thing there with IIS, it's actually, I believe it's ASP.NET that has some default configuration handlers that turn off download of that stuff. But you do bring up an interesting point, which is for all this to work, you need to make sure if you're on, and this is just specifically if you happen to be using IIS. I mean, if you're Apache Unix, it's going to be whatever specific to those servers. On IIS-6 and IIS-7, you do need to make sure the MIME type mappings do allow .xaml, because otherwise you don't get the XAML, and then also allow .dll, because, yeah, as you pointed out, otherwise you never get the DLL downloaded. And so what's probably realistic is on some sites that probably is turned off. You have to turn it on.
But then you'd get accessibility to, then users could theoretically download also your ASP.NET.
Actually, so that shouldn't end up happening, because then what you can do is you can say, okay, in ASP.NET, you can say, great, if a request ever happens to get routed into the ASP.NET pipeline for a DLL, that you can set up, there's like a forbidden handler or whatever it is that you can set in the HTTP handlers section. So the trick there is, in IIS, who actually gets the request for .dll? Is it IIS? Like, is it like a .htm, in which case IIS just serves it statically? Right. Or did you go out and set up, there's like the ISAPI extension mapping that actually routed it into ASP.NET? If you happen to have done the latter, then yeah, what you're going to have to do is get the DLL separated out into a directory that's not actually owned by ASP.NET.
Okay, so what is the recommended way, or what's the typical setup?
I mean, honestly, right now that's a bit in flux. The reason why I say that is, again, if you looked at it, I'm using the Orcus Beta 1 with the SL Tools add-in, and you saw there was actually I should have it here, there's like a little client bin directory. We haven't really iterated specifically on, here it is, this guy. we haven't iterated on how, on how we're going to make that work. I mean, one idea we've been kicking around is saying, hey, how about in ASP.NET, just like we have app data, app code, all those, maybe we'll go out and add into ASP.NET the notion of client bin, and it's okay to serve DLLs from client bin, but not from anywhere else. So again, it's a little bit early days, but that's probably the direction we'll go down.
All right, 2 questions. On isolated storage, if you're building an app and you know that you need to have, say, 10 or 15 megabytes of isolated storage on the client, you mentioned that there's, in the future, will be some sort of user management console where they can crank up the size, but that sounds like it's global to all sort of apps. Is there some mechanism so that you can have your application requesting isolated storage of a certain size, and that will bring up a user engagement?
Right. Yeah, so the best thing I can say at this point is, like, we absolutely are thinking about that scenario. I don't have an answer for you because at this point we have to go out and design, like, what does it mean to have either administrative or user interaction that says machine-wide, app-wide, per URL. Like, what, in essence, what we're envisioning is there's going to be a hierarchy of settings, and I can't tell you what it is right now because we haven't designed it.
Just please don't make us send the user out to to the control panel to go fix this.
Right. Well, so that's an interesting thing. We were thinking about a couple of ideas. One was, assuming you trust your users, one option was like have something where you could like right-click on the Silverlight control, and it has like a little, hey, configure Silverlight for whatever. And then the other idea was, again, I mean, we're talking a lot about this in the context of the consumer space, but I don't know, let's say I'm from the Department of Defense, they probably don't want all their employees happily configuring Silverlight. So that's the other side of it is, again, what does it mean to like have an Active Directory or the registry, a bunch of settings that can say, hey, ISO store turned on, off, global setting, and then per host name settings and things like that. So like I said, the best I can tell you is absolutely there'll be more ways to configure it, but at this point I don't know what they are.
Great, thank you. Second question
Sure.
on the open dialogue, open file dialogue, is there any option or interest in having that opening file lists that are out on the cloud rather than the local machine?
The reason why I'm thinking right now is I'm not sure that we actually turned that off in the current open file dialog implementation. You may very well be able to go HTTP:// and that may actually work. But yeah, I mean, the general idea is what we want is as much as possible for open file dialog to just work the way it does, the way any customer understands it on their OS. So it's just, we probably haven't tested that code path at this point. But yeah, there'd be an interest. I mean, the specific thing I'm thinking there that's obvious, just coming from a Microsoft background, is like, hey, SharePoint. Everything's sitting on my SharePoint site. It's not necessarily C:/#. It's my SharePoint portal, WebDAV, whatever the heck it is.
Right. Or Spaces photos or things like that.
Yep. Yeah. So definitely, we'll look into that. Thanks. Okay. Well, thanks again, folks. I appreciate you dropping by, and hopefully we'll see you next year at next year's Mix.